Hello everyone, this is The Missing Linked, and welcome to the halfway point of Dark Souls 3. And what I'm going to explain really quickly what these videos are. So, I don't know if you guys have been to my channel. Oh, before we talk anything about this, if you don't want Dark Souls 3 spoilers, don't watch this part of the video. Just listen to what I'm saying. I'll tell you when you can look at it again or annotate it, something along those lines. But considering this is a video that's about my impressions being changed halfway through the game or more, you should expect those sorts of things. But anyway, I digress. So, I'm going to explain really quickly what this video is. So this video is basically a thing I'm going to do for every game that I review going forward, and I talked about doing this on my site, but if you didn't read it, it is a halfway point video that I'm going to do to see how my impressions have changed of a game when I get halfway through it. Mechanics, what things I've seen, how the game has improved or gotten worse, etc., and also provide what I think the value proposition is, as well as my ideas of the replayability, etc., at this point in the game. It's not going to be a very long video, not even near as long as what's in the game, but it is going to hopefully provide a little bit of insight, because kind of tracking my progression of the review of the game, so that, wow, it's actually running worse right now than it was before. Huh. Okay, anyway, to sort of like track my progression through the game, and maybe I'll do some sorts of like other further progression type videos later so that you can have a very thorough review process. That's the point of this video. That being said, what are we doing here? Obviously it's Dark Souls 3. There's a few things I need to mention. So I'm also going to use this to sort of give you a bit of an update of what's going on. I'm still working on the Dark Souls 3 documentary. We have 8 pages of the script complete so far, and I'm going to intersplice it with my friend's narration. Now, I'm sure some of you have seen the novel that the PC Gamer, I can't remember his name, one of the writers for PC Gamer just released about his experience with Dark Souls 1. I've been working on this before I even knew that was a thing. I just got out about it yesterday, but I have a few things to say. So something that I took to heart when I wanted to start making new content again is it's not what's being done per se, it's how it's being presented. So what I'm trying to do is more track the game's mechanics and its legacy through its ancestors up to the current iterations, as well as personal experiences with the game across both different platforms and such like that. And so I do feel like, although, you know, I can't get in contact with Miyazaki myself, I've tried to get in contact with a few FromSoft employees to get interviews and such, I still feel like I can bring something else to the video that hasn't been done so far. Otherwise, I'm not going to, be discouraged enough not to finish it. I'm going to do it anyway, because no one's done a documentary, at least not to my knowledge, like this. So even though something like this is being somewhat done, it's not being done in this manner, which is, I think, the point that's important. It's also a showcase of my talent, and it won't be the only one I do, but it is just the first game I do in this fashion. Besides the fact that it is a series I'm going to be doing for Dark Souls 2 and also Bloodborne at some point, and other games, and I'm going to probably start my editorials tomorrow, because I haven't been making too much progress on this. I also have a couple other series I want to try and draft, or go ahead and throw out in the wild and see what you guys think of those, having to do with like game patches and stuff like that, so I can have a variety of things going up, useful, meaningful content. So all that being said, all about this Dark Souls 3. Well, I intended to do this video about a week ago, actually, not too long after I did my first impressions video, because now I played the game for like 40 hours, and I've gotten far more than halfway through. As a matter of fact, I've only got the final boss of the game left. So why do this and not just skip to the review? There's a couple reasons why. First of all, I haven't found everything there is to find yet, I don't think, and I'm trying to go through and be as thorough as possible. Second of all, when I get around to New Game Plus, which is what I'm going to do before I write the review, because I know everybody else got to play the game before me and review it before me, so I figure if I'm going to write a review, I want to bring something to it that hasn't been done, because I can do the same content as anybody else. Sure, I know all these people, these channels and stuff that do this content, but what I aim to do is I know how I feel I can do it better, and I can take that content to a degree that reflects something someone wants to see at a better standard. So what I've chosen to do is I'm not going to write my review for Dark Souls 3 until I've gone through New Game Plus, because I want to be able to also put into account the replayability of the game. That being said, if you're going to take that into account, even though I'm at the final boss of the game technically right now, I've only gotten halfway through what I intended to do, so this video is still relevant. Now then, what's been changed and how have my impressions of the game changed so far? Well, there's a few things I didn't mention before, just a few small things that, in terms of like the detail and stuff, like the Estus flasks visibly going down when you use them. That's just something that I didn't mention before that I absolutely adore. But impressions, right? So I've obviously seen far more of the bosses in the areas than I did before, and I'm going to go ahead and go to a few of them and let you see. Now I'm just going to let you know I have an outline of what I'm doing for this, but this video is largely unscripted, unlike the What's in the Game or the Dark Souls documentaries, which, by the way, like I was saying, I have not finished that because, good reason, I've tried to get as much information as possible, and I have someone who's doing animations and graphics for me, so it's going to be pretty great. I'm putting a lot of effort into this video, and I'll have it done when it's done. I know I don't have a lot of people to answer to, so it's for my enjoyment, really. But let's talk about a few of the later areas. So when I last did a video, I had made it as far as... where was I? I think I made it as far as maybe... it was like Keep Ruins, that's it. I was as far as like the Keep Ruins. I had just fought the Abyss Watchers as far as I remember. And now, of course, I've gotten much further than that. A couple things to note. So, some of the later areas are actually quite gorgeous. I know that I've said about the game's color palette and stuff being quite drab, and it still is a little bit dull, but the game has a few things up its sleeve it uses to really strike a balance. The areas that you see later in the game are some of the most gorgeous I've seen in a Dark Souls game, period. You'll see what I mean in just a second. Take a look at that. This is Irithyll of the Boreal Valley. Now, anybody who played Bloodborne probably knows about Castle Cainhurst, and Castle Cainhurst is one of my favorite locations in the Souls games in general. I just really dig the whole Castlevania snowy castle vibe thing that's going on there. And Boreal Valley takes it to 11, and I just love the visual design of it. It's not only elegant as hell, but the Borealis going on in the background, the atmosphere that this area sets, is something that arguably tops anything you've seen in a Souls game before. It's gorgeous. It has everything that you expect from a Dark Souls location. It's foreboding, you want to explore it, and it looks like there's a party going on back there. I mean, it looks like a location from an anime, if I'm being completely honest. Or out of some sort of art book. It's obviously something that had a lot of effort go into it. Now, there's a couple things I need to mention. The level design of Dark Souls 3, it's still pretty good all the way through up to where the final boss is. It's still very dense and very well packed, but in the case of a lot of these areas, like for instance, Irithyll here, I'm not exactly sure what I expected, but like, you are still observing a lot of the outside of these locations. So, unlike, say, for instance, Castle Cainhurst, where you are able to go inside this gigantic castle and you see its bookshelves and you move them around and stuff, which, by the way, this game does have an area like that. You are observing this from the outside, seeing its beauty from a different perspective, and I was at first a little bit disappointed about that, but I think the thing that needs to, I guess, be considered here is what this means from lore perspective. Like, you get to see some of the other areas, and what this leads up to is a really neat boss fight, and you get a lot of the woodsy things going around here. I guess I thought it would have been cool coming in here to see if there was like some sort of festival going on, something along those lines. But it does still nail that atmosphere, and the way the moon's setting, and some of the locations you do go around to. It's just the lighting, everything about it is great from a location perspective. It's very elegant. I'll put it that way. That being said, does that hold true for every area? Well, that's an interesting argument. So, most of this area, Irithyll of the Boreal Valley, as much as I absolutely adore it, which I cannot lie, I do, and again, playing this game while talking is not the best for me. It's a good thing that I am over-leveled, because I would probably be dead right now if I was not at the level that I currently am. Ow. Also make note that there is supposed to be a patch dropping this evening. I do believe during the time that I'm recording this, so the game will probably start running better, and if it does, I will also make an update about that. Anyways, that most of the area looks kind of like this. You're in an outdoors area. You kind of a few buildings you go inside of, but this is generally what it looks like. It reminds me a bit of the Dark Souls 2 DLC, Eliam Lois, but you don't explore a lot of the surroundings. I don't know. I mean, I like the entire aesthetic of it, though, and it is still very tightly knit, and there's a lot to see in this relatively small vertical slice of the Boreal Valley. Now, that being said, there are other areas surrounding Boreal Valley that end up being really interesting. And this is not the only area that has very interesting level design. So, actually, while you could argue that the area you're coming through, even though this place is absolutely gorgeous and atmospheric, it's... no. You know, you could just say, oh, well, it's a bunch of corridors, and, you know, you're not completely wrong. And that is some of the areas in Dark Souls 3, but it does still have that Dark Souls scope about it, which is what I think is the most important factor. That being said, there are a few other areas that manage to sort of pull off that really weavy, mazy level design pretty well. I actually have one area in particular that's become one of my favorite areas in all the Souls games, and I do wish it was a little longer, but I'm going to go ahead and warp to the bonfire and show you what it is. But in the case of something like Irithyll, the Boreal Valley, you do have areas where you do go around the outsides toward the end of the level, and I appreciate that. I like that area. That area is part of what represents the best parts of Dark Souls 3's level design going forward, and there are a few areas that felt incredibly short. Whether they were or not is not necessarily the case, because I do know that they have a lot of things packed in these areas, and this game actually has loads of things to find. I mentioned this before, and it's mostly carried through. Like, there is lots of stuff that I didn't realize I missed when I was combing through the areas again before the final boss fight. That being said, I think all of in my personal opinion, most of the game's strengths can be attributed to this one area. While we're on the way here, I'm going to say, in the case of like the Boreal Valley, what I was saying about its areas and stuff is the way that they're designed. Well, they are narrow, yes. In this area, the Profane Capital takes what's rather narrow about the entirety of some of these levels and makes it feel a lot larger than it is. I'm actually going to show you what I mean. Ow. Oh man, that was bad. By going out here, and I'm going to go ahead and go to this bridge on the outside of the level, because what this area essentially is ancient Greece. And I absolutely love this aesthetic. It reminds me of the underground from Demon's Souls, which I have mentioned before. I did not beat Demon's Souls, but I've played several areas in Demon's Souls. Not enough to do a real truth video, but enough to talk about it. So, if you can see this from... and there's a gargoyle that just spawned behind me. I'm not going to fight him. I'm just going to leave him be. This area looks like the Colosseum, doesn't it? Yes, yes it does. And you know what else is wonderful about this? If we go back in here, I'm going to go back to the bonfire. Just stay away from this man. He's going to try and kill me. It's got that very large, like, crumbling architecture. Everything is built for people that are bigger than you aesthetic sort of thing that Dark Souls 1 had going for it. Bloodborne does as well. Though it doesn't quite feel as varied, I guess you can say, in terms of like its aesthetic color palette and types of buildings and stuff as Dark Souls 2 may have had going for it. But even though most of the areas are big, grand cathedrals and stuff in Dark Souls 3, this area more or less reflects what I love about the good levels in Dark Souls 3, and there aren't really that many bad ones per se, but there are a few that felt kind of underwhelming, and here's what I mean. The atmosphere in this area is absolutely stunning. You can see the influences here to something like thematically, and I guess you can also say from a metaphorical perspective, you could say this area has ties to yes, I'll definitely try jumping. Especially if you know the boss in this area. to things such as Greek tragedies such as Oedipus and such. And if you know the lore, if you read it, it really ties in to the visual aesthetics, and it looks really cool, at least to me. I just dig the statues being here. It adds a little bit more character to this area, and the things that you can find while roaming around. Now, this area is not particularly large. I will say that much. As a matter of fact, with the exception of going over here and finding all these poison spiders, which I'm not going to go over there because I don't feel like fighting them, and I won't spoil it too much, there's really only this dome and this building right here, which is a lot smaller than it looks. But what it manages to pack into this small area in terms of artistic vision and feel is what truly matters, at least in my opinion. Because there are some long levels in Dark Souls 3, but none of them really felt like they had as much inspiration to me as some place like the Profaned Capital, which is what this level is. This level only has a few enemies and such, but they all attribute themselves nicely to the theme that they're going for. And especially since I really just dig all of like Greek mythology and such, and the themes how those themes actually tie really nicely into Dark Souls, if you know the lore, it just kind of made me come here and I was like, wow, this is a really cool location. It's not very big. It looks a lot bigger than it is, but then again, I guess it also kind of doesn't if you just assume that building over there isn't large. But what I mean by that is, if you just come down here, I'm going to go ahead and come down here. And also, there's an item I just I forgot to completely pick up. But most of the stuff is just in one small space. It's all on top of each other. It's very vertical, which is what I was saying before about Dark Souls 3. But the overall area isn't overly large. In this case, I didn't care as much. When I went to the Boreal Valley and I thought, you know, this place is really pretty, but it felt kind of linear, and not necessarily in a bad way, but I just wanted to see more of the architecture of that area, and instead of the streets, I expected something kind of like this, because even though we aren't seeing that much of it, what we do get to see does really reflect the theme and feel that From was going for in the areas of Dark Souls 3, and this is really what Dark Souls 3 is in a nutshell, and its best locations can showcase. Because there actually is a decent bit of things you can find. I mean, there's a couple other areas I won't spoil for you in here that you can get to from like a rooftop, and there's some interesting creative enemies around here. Someone was on some seriously good drugs that just make you feel like everything is grander than it is. It captures that feel that Dark Souls 1 had. And then there are areas such as the Irithyll Dungeon. Fuck everything the Irithyll Dungeon stands for. The Irithyll Dungeon is actually a really cool area for the most part. It's actually surprisingly dense for what it is. And it's really interesting how you stumble upon this place, because if you think about looking at everything Irithyll has to offer, and you consider this as part of the main of Irithyll above, Irithyll of the Boreal Valley, then Irithyll is huge. Of course, that's not what I was thinking when I thought Irithyll, but Irithyll Dungeon is probably the most unique area in Dark Souls 3. Well, definitely one of them. For starters, the enemies in here are definitely the creepiest. I talked a bit about these guys on the podcast, but these little fuckers are the jailers, and apologies, I won't swear too much, but they are fun friends. I actually was wearing their set for a little while, because I actually quite like the aesthetics of it. They're creepy, and what they do, screw everything he stands for. He usually pushes you off the side. What they usually do is when they see you, they scream and release this mist that takes your maximum health and reduces it. And it don't mean like it makes it so you can heal yourself with an Estus Flask. It literally reduces your maximum health. And they also can kill you with a soldering iron. Yeah. On top of that, There are a couple other enemies in here. I really want to talk about them. I don't want to spoil them too much, but there are these slug monsters that you'll encounter, and the first time you see them, you'll probably jump if you're anything like me. And I play a lot of horror games, but their placement and the way that you see them, especially considering that they don't necessarily do anything to you, they were a surprise, and they also are aesthetically just abominations. Also, every enemy in this location just really can screw you over. There are several traps in this dungeon that are completely evil, and I mean bravo, Miyazaki, because it's some of the most despicable traps I've seen in a Dark Souls game. The way that it caught me off guard with some of this one trap involving like 7 or 8 basilisks was just ridiculous. It wasn't unfair per se, you had enough working room, but it was nuts. And that's the room I was just talking about. I'm not going to go in there right now. Not because I'm afraid to, but because I'm just going to, I don't have a reason to go in there, and I'm going to let you guys find out what's in there on your own. As up with any Dark Souls experience. And I missed. Don't let these guys hit you. So, actually, as I was about to say, interestingly, this dungeon is supposed to invoke levels from Demon Souls. A few people might realize that. I didn't play enough of it to really get the feel. I mean, in Demon Souls. But you could definitely tell, like, it's an asylum, and it kind of is a homage to several different things. But it feels more desperate. Like, there are skulls everywhere. There's a warden inside of a cell. There are these body things again. And when you actually find out the lore of this place, it's quite creepy. And this area as a whole actually has a lot of atmosphere. From a design perspective, it's an okay level design. Some of the things feel a little cheap. Some of them are too concentrated. Like there's a place down towards the bottom with like, I think there's 6 jailers there, and they're really hard to take out unless you have a lot of vitality. And on top of that, the entirety of the level, the jailers feel a little bit cheap, but as a whole, the level is pretty tightly designed, if not a little bit cheap than what Dark Souls typically has. It's not a lackluster level. It is a good one. And also, I guess while we're here, I could talk a little bit about lateral thinking. So, I will come back to what I was saying about the puzzles. But because I'm over here, this area is something you should take note of. You'll know why when I talk to when you go to an area later on, but there is a hidden area which involves you coming here. And this is a good case of the game incorporating lateral thinking. Anybody that's played something like Myst or The Witness more recently will recognize when you have a contextual clue given to you later in the game, you may want to come back to an area where that seemed to be hinted at, but you couldn't figure out what to do before to solve a puzzle, and it gives you access to something that you wouldn't have necessarily realized was there. It was clever, and it was a nice little thing from Software introduced that I wouldn't have known to come back here. I completely forgot about it, but I did figure out how to get into this area on my own, and it was a nice thing that I was like, okay, that's cool. It's something that gives me something else to look for, you know? If you're really one of those puzzle solver types and stuff, you'll have a lot of something to look forward to. And this is the area I was talking about that makes this area somewhat cheap. It's not an amazing area. It's a good area, the Earthel Dungeon. I like it a decent enough. But this area is also very cheap because of this. Things like this are very common. I'm not going to go and fight these guys. I have no desire to. But that leans into a few other things with the level design that I wanted to actually get to really quickly in terms of how my impressions have changed. So I talked a lot about, I kept saying derivative in my impressions video. That's not the case. I meant to say iterative and fan servicey. This game has a lot of fan service that really carries over. And to some degree, it actually gets more noticeable towards the end of the game, but I couldn't determine whether or not I found it grating or endearing towards the end of the game, and here's why. One of the coolest and also worst levels in the game happens to be in Anor Londo. Anor Londo is incredibly straightforward. It takes place after you fight Pontiff Sullivan. And, well, it's more or less just a straight shot to the boss. I was hoping we could explore more of this area, but it almost feels like the developers are like, well, this area exists for fan service, so, you know, there you go. And from fan service perspective, it's great. There's some cool things here, and you're going to see some friends in just a second if you're watching. Look at these guys. Hi, remember you, friends? And also, the Anor Londo archers made a return. Not here, but in an area preceding this. And you could obviously argue that the area preceding this is similar to actual Anor Londo because it's an area that we never got to explore before. Just, it would have still been interesting to see more of it. And I'm hoping later, like in the DLC and stuff, we get to see some more areas that we've been wanting to see or see some stuff return. And there are other areas from Dark Souls 1 we get to go back to. One of them is actually rather detailed. It's another hidden area. And I won't spoil it for you, but there's a lot of really nice little NPC nods that felt endearing and genuine in terms of things like Quelaag, Quelana, NPCs like that. That felt genuine and really felt like they're sending off the series in a good way. Whereas something like Anor Londo, it still feels like they're trying, although it did come across a little bit more cynical. That's not to say I don't like it. I do especially appreciate coming back here and just seeing what it looks like after all these years. Hi, Deacons of the Deep. Now, where does that leave everything else I had to say about the game before? Well, alright, so bosses. How did my impressions change to the bosses? They're all pretty memorable still, actually. Even the ones that did not, that were not incredibly amazing fights, and even though there were a decent bit of dudes in armor, I will say, and people complain about Dark Souls 2, and while there technically were a lot there, it's because there's more bosses in Dark Souls 2. There's like 30 without the DLC as opposed to 18 in Dark Souls 3. And while we're on that subject, Dark Souls 1 had like 20, but Bloodborne has 11, and if you're going to compare the size like that, that's not necessarily how you do it, because Dark Souls 3 and Bloodborne are much more tightly packed games, right? So there's more to discover, and it feels like the games are more detailed because of that. And look at this. I got a Sun Princess swing. It's a shame. So someone did destroy the Shadow of Guinevere after all. Huh. I never came up here after the boss fight, and it occurred to me that I probably should. So anyway, that's what I mean. There's a lot of things to find. There are a decent bit of dudes in armor, and the ratio, like, if you go and compare, because I did this earlier out of curiosity, and compare the amount of bosses in Dark Souls 1 as the dudes in armor to monsters. Most of the bosses in Dark Souls 1 are monsters, if we're not including, like, Artorias. In Dark Souls 2, they're, like, half and half, 2/3 to 1/3, something like that. It's just because there's more bosses that very few of them stand out, and the ones that do are guys that feel like dudes in armor. The difference is, and while you could argue that, you might feel like more of them are monsters here, more of them are dudes in armor, but I think it feels okay, and people are giving it a pass because they do have more memorable fights to them, because a lot of the boss fights going forward, I noticed, are far more experimental. So by the end of the game, the boss fights, they incorporate more Bed of Chaos style methods to fighting them. Like, there's really cool lore things intertwined in them. You can really tell they're trying to push that story aspect and making the game feel final with something like Yorm the Giant and the way the NPC quest lines are interacted. And another reason, by the way, that I'm still doing this before the review, is that I have not done any of the NPC quest lines. I managed to mess up every single one of them, and in my New Game Plus playthrough, I'm going to try to not screw that up. That's something the patch is supposed to be affecting as well, because I'm very sad that I messed that up. And those bosses feel pretty memorable. A few of them not as much, but like the final boss, like one of the final fights, the one with Lothric, was really cool and creepy. Aldridge was also quite a creepy fight and had a lot of really neat nods. And it's just, in general, the bosses do mostly feel memorable. Maybe it's because their music is really good. Maybe it's because their aesthetics are better. But that's just the long and short of it. And a few of them are not as cool. Like the Deacons of the Deep is basically just the celestial beings from Bloodborne. I mean, there's a couple bosses in here that feel like they're from Bloodborne. As a matter of fact, there's a couple things in here that feel like they're from Bloodborne. You can surely tell they were working on the games at the same time, because there's even like a whole dark zone that goes on, and I won't spoil too much about what you find there, but if you play Bloodborne, you'll know what I'm talking about. You'll know what's kind of going on. And also on that note, one of the last things I kind of want to talk about is the final boss is basically the final boss of Bloodborne mixed with Gwyn. But certain things that I talked about not being followed through, mechanics not kind of being followed through, they sort of did make their return later in the game, and I was happy to see that. They weren't overused, and I understand why they didn't use them, and they didn't by no means did what they were said to do, you know, in the pre-releases to infecting every boss and stuff, but they have a thematic reason for bringing the things back when they do, and everything seems to make sense. And on that note, you know, while there's a lot of familiarity, it mostly came across as genuine. I do feel like this is a very fan servicey Dark Souls, and you can tell that the formula is starting to find itself into a home. It's over with. And I mean, Miyazaki just said recently that they're done with Dark Souls, at least for a while. He wants to go do something completely different. He knows when to quit. A good artist does, right? And what the?
You're alive.
Fucking Patches.
Now, hold your horses. Let's have a nice talk about this.
Oh my goodness, I haven't been able to find him the entire playthrough. Nope. Get out of here! Yeah, so Patches will kill every single NPC in the game, by the way, if you don't find him. I'm just letting you know he's worse than every other Dark Souls game, period, and he looks even creepier. Anyway, as I was saying, the entirety of what you find and stuff like that, it, you know, does end up coming across genuine, and that's a good mark of artistry. The design of everything, the atmosphere, it may feel shorter, but that's probably because you're just better at the game. Because, I mean, my first playthrough this game took actually just about as long as it did to play through Dark Souls 2 the first time. It's just Dark Souls 2 had more square footage. And while there is nothing after the 5 Lords of Cinder, I will say that much, you still have lots of things to discover. And the amount of effort they put into the New Game Plus from what I've seen so far, and also considering that this is the last journey and there's so much time to a tight space, it feels fine. I'll put it that way. I'm not entirely sure if I would say, you know, I don't like it better than Bloodborne, maybe just because Bloodborne did feel fresher, even though it had some similar problems, and maybe it is because mechanically things are so different and whatnot, but I really have enjoyed my time with Dark Souls 3. It's enchanting. It is. But it also is a game you can very much tell is the last Dark Souls game. For better or for worse. I'm going to be excited to see what they do with the DLC. And I'm also satisfied and somewhat... I'm not sure what the word I'm looking for is here. Oh. Not sad, but I could feel the realism of what they're having to do here. It's every Dark Souls game. It is a greatest hits Dark Souls game, and my impressions have changed to be a little bit less harsh than I was, and I definitely still enjoy this game a lot, and in most ways, it is the second best Souls game, but it also is the most fan servicey, and if you're a fan of the games, then you're obviously really gonna like that. So there's that. The game doesn't run much better, but Dark Souls 3 is the grand finale of Dark Souls games. It's the cap of the trilogy. I would compare it to being like, you know, the Return of the King. You could argue it's the best one, even though you may not be the most enamored with it by the time you're done, just because you have seen these things before. But you can also appreciate that you've seen these things before, because the developers are clearly putting their heart and soul into it and having the most fun. And I think that's what matters the most. And that's why the game Dark Souls 3 is half full. And from a business perspective, I guess I forgot to mention this, I think so far the business proposition is worth it if you're a Dark Souls fan. And if you're a newcomer, this might also be the best place to start. And if you're not interested in Dark Souls 3, this isn't going to convince you, but as far as that goes, for me, it's worth it. Whether or not it would be worth it all over again has yet to be seen, and that's what I'm going to get in the review. But like I said, for me, Dark Souls 3 is half full. See you guys.